Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And this episode, we have mineral rights news for August of 2024. We're in the dog days of summer, Justin. It was actually a little bit of a slow news month, but there are some pretty interesting stories that we came across, really focused on Texas. So if you have minerals and royalties in Texas, you definitely want to listen all the way to the end because there's litigation that's going on with this operator that they're looking to liquidate their assets to help pay some debts. So it's going to potentially affect mineral and royalty owners. So we'll dive in and let you know what you should be aware of. And the first one, folks that have minerals and royalties in West Texas, this is something that you should pay attention to. And it's the plans to expand the Muleshoe Wildlife Refuge in Texas, which is drawing some criticism here, Justin.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. It's an interesting program because it seems to be an opt-in program rather than a eminent domain program. But the article here says the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service released a final plan in April that would allow for the protection of up to 700,000 acres of wildlife habitat as part of the Muleshoe National Wildlife Refuge. The finalized plan for the expansion of the Muleshoe in the Panhandle, approximately 30 miles east of New Mexico border, has received some pushback. The initiative relies on the cooperation of private landowners who are interested in selling land or granting easements for conservation efforts. It does not impose any mandatory regulations or expropriate land in proximity to the refuge. Landowners can participate through fee title acquisition, which would be outright selling their land, or easement acquisitions, which would involve the fund purchasing certain rights to the land, such as the right to restrict development, while the landowner retains ownership. And Matt, I'm sure we've had programs like this before, but this is the first program I've really seen structured like this. So it's interesting that they're doing this as an opt-in.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's interesting because normally you hear about these types of programs on federal land where they designate certain federal lands as part of a wildlife refuge or something like that. So that designation would limit development. In this case, in Texas in general, there's a majority of the land is private. There's not a lot of federal. There is some state. But in this case, they have this Muleshoe National Wildlife Refuge with the current footprint when this was passed and went into effect in April of 2024 was 6,440 acres. And they're looking to protect up to 700,000 acres of wildlife habitat. So that's 110 times the current size. So that was a little bit interesting. It's not just an incremental increase in this wildlife refuge. And there has been a lot of pushback from local stakeholders, and State Representative Jody Arrington out of Lubbock has proposed some legislation to defund this particular initiative. So in other words, I guess if you had people that were willing to sell their land, that there wouldn't be the money for the government to actually purchase the land. So they're trying to look to stop this. The concern from a mineral and royalty owner perspective, and there was a town hall locally there in the end of July, I guess about a week or so ago. We're recording this on August 1st. And the sense from that was that the state ag commissioner and a bunch of local representatives, as well as a NGO that was formed to oppose this, in fact. So there has been a lot of people sort of getting more information about this, trying to understand how it could affect them. But I think the big concern is that it would limit your grazing. So for the folks from the ag side of things, farming and ranching, it would limit that agricultural opportunity there when that's a big part of the economy. And then the other side of that is energy development. And certainly in West Texas, that is the epicenter of where oil and gas development is occurring. I looked at the outline of where they're proposing, the maximum 700,000 acres. And if you outline that against where oil and gas activity is, certainly there are a lot of wells that are going to be affected by this, existing wells. Not a ton of drilling that has occurred in the last few years in that area, but it doesn't preclude that from happening in the future. And so I think that is the The big concern is if you were to have, let's say, a surface owner that would sell their land to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and you owned severed mineral interests, and part of this whole program is to limit energy development, then the concern is that there would be a taking and that you would not get fair compensation for your mineral interest. The surface rights, what they're saying is because this is a voluntary program, it's an opt-in program. Like you mentioned, Justin, I think that you would get a fair market offer for your land and you could sell it or designate a conservation easement or something like that and get fair market value for that. But ultimately, it's part of an overarching program that the Biden administration has announced called the America the Beautiful Initiative. And do you want to talk a little bit about what that is, Justin?
Yeah, absolutely, ma'am. So the America the Beautiful initiative, the expansion is part of the Biden administration's $1 billion initiative to accelerate the conservation efforts, as you mentioned, Matt, across the U.S. using the federal conservation and restoration investments in partnership with private and philanthropic contributions to restore at least 30% of the U.S. lands and waters by 2030. So this is a huge program, Matt, and isn't going to be limited to Texas, but this is the first I've heard of it kind of rolling out as an opt-in program, at least.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting that they have that target of 30% of U.S. lands and waters by 2030. That could be a significant amount of land. And I think, again, when you hear the word conservation and restoration, it's important that we conserve sensitive wildlife habitat for sure. But to the extent that they're doing this in areas that are questionable, I think there's some question in this case. For example, in the article we'll link to in the show notes here, they mentioned that one of the reasons was they wanted to protect some particular species, which in fact I believe Fish and Wildlife Service delisted as a endangered species or on that list. So there was a question as to really how much is it actually protecting sensitive habitat and wildlife, or is it just more to block agriculture and energy development? Those two big methane emitters, basically. So from a climate change standpoint, I think this is sort of the underlying goal to do that. So certainly something to pay attention to. And if you're affected by this, attend some of those community meetings, get educated and learn what your options are, see what's really the best option for you. And if you decide to participate, that you at least have that information. But certainly a lot of controversy here on this particular program.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll see more information to come on how exactly this will be rolled out and handled as well, which will make it less scary at least, but it'd be interesting to see. So our next story here is about energy permitting bill that advances to the full Senate. Bipartisan legislation aimed at speeding up approvals for new energy products advanced to the full Senate Wednesday. Legislation put forward by Senator Joe Manchin and John Barrasso sailed through the committee in a 15-4 vote. The lawmakers opposed the legislation were Senator Ron Wyden, Bernie Sanders, Mazie Hirono, and Josh Hawley. The Barrasso-Manchin bill contains a range of provisions that aim to bolster various types of energy, including coal, mineral mining, oil and gas, renewable energy, and power lines. This week, more than 360 climate-focused organizations wrote a letter opposing the bill. It has significant support from various energy trade groups, including those that represent renewable power. And so this is an interesting kind of thing to roll out. And it really mostly has to do with the permitting process, it looks like, but trying to kind of streamline this and make it easier to get those permits approved.
Yeah, and I think that's a great initiative. I think certainly we've seen an incredible slowdown in the current administration in terms of permitting wells on and leasing, for that matter, on federal lands. So they've done just about everything in their power to stop oil and gas development on federal lands. Again, the government can't stop what you do with your private land, at least not yet. So certainly something that's good to see to try to streamline those processes. You need to have the protections in place. You need to have the reviews in place. But unfortunately, like we've seen, as the government grows to a certain level, the bureaucracy gets so large that it takes an inordinate amount of time to get a project approved. And if we're going to remain competitive globally, we need to have climate concerns addressed, habitat concerns, all those things, but then also a way for companies that are looking to invest in energy in the US, a way to actually deploy that capital and build those projects. And it's interesting, this is not really one form of energy, it's all forms of energy. So I think that's really important. And I'm always of the mindset that it's got to be an all of the above solution. So we're going to need fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas. We'll need renewables, we'll need nuclear power, we'll need all of that, and plus an upgraded infrastructure like new power lines and all of that to take care of the increased demand. Interestingly, there was an article I was reading this morning talking about data centers and AI and what's the expected increase in natural gas demand because those data centers require like nearly 100% uptime. And so that means they need very reliable power, and that really precludes renewables, even though I'm sure companies would like to use more renewables in data center applications, but really they need nuclear or natural gas. And so the thought process is okay, if we see this demand increasing, what's that going to really mean for natural gas demand going forward in terms of power generation for data centers? And I think that's something that this bill would address as you think about the power generation side of things and the distribution through upgrading the grid, which is, we'll have to do a little bit more digging, but I've heard anecdotally that it's aging and not in good shape and it can't handle the demand of all this future development that we're going to have. So I think this is a much needed legislation now. It'll be interesting to see what happens once it gets into the full Senate and if it dies there, but hopefully it doesn't. Hopefully it'll move forward.
You said it, Matt, and I think it has some better chances since it is covering all forms of energy. Hopefully that'll help to kind of grease the wheels and get the Senate to look at it a little bit more seriously than if they were just talking about fossil fuels.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Matt. Here, our next one here was from one of our listeners and somebody that we have a pretty close relationship with here on the show. It's some information for mineral owners in eastern Texas, particularly Cass and Morris counties, creditors of Barrow Shaver, which has been one of the key operators in those two counties, have petitioned the court to force the company into a Chapter 7 involuntary bankruptcies. These creditors are owed about $8.5 million. These are not the only creditors, but these are the ones so far that are looking to take action. The petition was filed on July 23rd. And so, Matt, this is not uncommon to see this happen, but it can certainly impact mineral owners, especially if they're one of the major operators. You could expect checks to cease and you have to file claims, and it just can get really sticky really fast.
Yeah, and I think certainly bankruptcies are fairly common in the oil and gas industry with the boom and bust nature. And we've seen a lot of those, and they've all mostly been Chapter 11. And so that's why we wanted to highlight this one. The thing that really stood out to me was that it was an involuntary Chapter 7 bankruptcy. So the difference with the Chapter 11 is the company would have the ability to refinance its debt and try to emerge after the bankruptcy and be an ongoing concern. With the Chapter 7 bankruptcy, they're looking to liquidate the company. So they're basically looking to sell all of the company's assets to pay the creditors. And so that was something that was really interesting to me, was that it was involuntary. So this company apparently has not paid their service companies. So you have companies on here. There's HUD Pressure Control, which is a very well-known service company, Axis Energy Services, Genesis Fluids, Force Pressure Control. These companies have said, this is enough. You owe us. This article we'll link to was around $500,000 up to around $3 million per creditor, and they weren't going to get paid. And so they banded together and said, okay, let's force this company into a Chapter 7 liquidation so that we can get our money. So certainly something to pay attention to if you receive royalties from Barrow Shaver. And again, like our listener mentioned, this Boots on the Ground report, this is one of the two key operators in those two counties, in Cass and Morris counties. So if you have minerals in East Texas, definitely pay attention to this, see how it goes. Look for those bankruptcy notices, and if there's any response you need to give, make sure you do it in a timely manner to protect your rights. And then, of course, if you have any questions, be sure to contact an attorney that's familiar with bankruptcy law and with oil and gas, and they can help you navigate this if you're affected. So yeah, certainly interesting. And I think, again, the thing that really stood out to me, bankruptcies are pretty common. It's kind of weird that in the price cycle, you'd think about it, oil is around $80 a barrel. Why is there a company filing for bankruptcy? But then you got to remember that natural gas has been at near 50-year lows. And so it's very possible that they just weren't running the company well, and or their cost structure was such that with natural gas prices around $2 an MCF, that they just weren't making money and couldn't pay their bills. So that's sort of a concerning thing. And I wonder if it's maybe the tip of the iceberg when you have some of these poorly run companies that go first in the bankruptcy scenario. Unless we see natural gas prices recover, I wonder if there might be a few other companies following suit here, Justin.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. It'll be interesting to see. And as you mentioned with Chapter 7, a lot of responsible companies go the Chapter 11 route. And that may be what we start to see more of, but it'll be interesting to see.
Definitely. Well, let's dive into the rig count. We are at 568 land rigs. We're up 4 from the prior week, so that's a good sign. Although we're still quite a bit below where we were a year ago. A year ago, we had 640 rigs running across the onshore U.S. And so breakdown here is you see one rig was dropped in Louisiana. We added one in Alaska, added one in North Dakota, added 2 in Oklahoma. And the specific basins that added rigs was the Arkoma Woodford, Canna Woodford, the Eagleford, Williston, and then we lost a rig in the Mississippian and the Permian. So each respectively. So that is pretty flat, sort of just that kind of status quo situation. It's good to see that it sort of maybe is bottomed out here for the time being, Justin. But what do you think about this?
Yeah, you said about it. It's good to see that it's going up. I thought it was kind of interesting what areas those rigs got added in. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see if it continues to go up as we continue. Because as you mentioned, we've got to drill more wells to continue maintaining production where it is.
Yeah, really. That's the key thing is even with just maintaining production, we need to be drilling. And interesting, if you look at the state variances, I thought it was interesting that a few of the states are actually right where they were a year ago. Colorado was at 14 rigs a year ago, and that's where we are today. North Dakota was at 35 a year ago, and they're at 35 now with this increase of 1 rig. Oklahoma was at 39 a year ago, and we're back up to 35. So they're moving back up to where they were. Where we've seen some of the bigger drops, I think, has really been in the gas plays. So Louisiana was at 51. Now they're at 41. You have Pennsylvania, surprisingly, was at 22 a year ago and is still holding strong around 21. Wyoming was at 19. They're at 11. But the big drop has been in Texas, where Texas had 322 rigs operating a year ago. Now we're at 276. That's where the biggest change has occurred. But certainly, I was kind of surprised actually to see that there were a few states that have kind of held steady. So that, to me, to your point, Justin, shows that those particular states are probably at their maintaining production level in terms of activity. I think Texas was growing, and this is going to start to slow down a little bit, but I think we're still growing production in the Permian slightly at the current rate. But most of these other places are just in the kind of maintenance mode for the time being. So.
You said it, Matt. And there for a while in Texas, the prices were just absolutely insane for both leasing and acquisitions. And so I'm sure that has something to do with it, along with, like you said, the price not being so great for gas.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, that wraps up this month's news episode. Again, you can find the links to all of the articles we mentioned in the episode in the show notes at mineralrightspodcast.com. If you've come across a story like our listener that emailed us the East Texas news, send us an email to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com and we'll feature it on the show. Thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.